Hi.
Hello, everybody. Look up if you're not looking up already, because there's something on your screen that we don't usually have on screen. It's something, a relic of our past, which we'll explain shortly. We're hoping the thumbnail will capture a shot of this. If not, we'll have to do something else. But we made that sign around 1989, 1990 for the first phase of our protest, public protests that we did a year or two, up till about 5 years after we left. There was a big part of our activities every year, gathering Christians, some ex-witnesses, but mostly Christians who were concerned about Jehovah's Witnesses. And we would take those signs, probably around 30 of them, some with some regular placards with sticks, and we'd be carrying them or standing with them at parking lots outside Maple Leaf Gardens in downtown Toronto, and also the Sky Dome, as it was called back then. It's called the Rogers Centre, the baseball stadium of the Toronto Blue Jays today. But it had just opened in 1989 when we started doing these protests. And as you just saw, the sign at the time seemed totally relevant. 3 generations of Jehovah's Witnesses have died in a false hope. Don't be the 4th.
Right.
But of course now, another 30 years or so has gone by, and that 4th generation has died in a false hope. Now we have to, if we were to do it again, we'd have to say, don't be the 5th. And we didn't know at the time that within a few years, of course, the Watchtower generation teaching would be changed. But you do remember in the last phase of our contacts with our witness friends and family, before we would DF what you said.
We more or less predicted, we said, you just watch, they're going to change something to do with 1914, of the generation. They have to change it because they're running out of time. And
some of them resisted the idea, like that's ridiculous. And I can understand why they did, because there was so much emphasis upon this at that time. For instance, we have a 1987 Watchtower article in front of us right now, which is directed at the general public, and they're certainly not backing off 1914, even though 12 years has gone by since 1975. You would think they'd be being more cautious about the generation teaching, but the accent in this article is upon the composite sign from 1914 onward, and upon the fact that that generation is fading fast and will be gone within, well, a few years. But 3 paragraphs are devoted in this article directed at the people at the door about Bible prophecy being fulfilled today, and part of it, in addition to the wars and the famines and the pestilences and the general lawlessness, is this. One of the paragraphs, the last one before they get to their bottom line, is, now why is there such a fascination today with astrology and other forms of the occult? Such widespread interest in occult practices such as astrology shouldn't surprise us. It is one of the symptoms of the anguish that people are experiencing today in fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy. And I couldn't agree more. The fascination with the occult and the increase in the public awareness of what occult practices are teaching is definitely a sign of the times. But then they get to their subhead after a prophecy fulfilled today. The next subhead is, lift your head up. And here's how it reads, the next 2 paragraphs. What should Christians do when they see all these things? Give way to fear, like the people around them, that is, the people who are interested in the occult. Jesus offered the following counsel, quote, but as these things start to occur, raise yourselves erect, lift your heads up, because your deliverance is getting near. Would you like to know the future? That is, let me reread that. Would you like to know your future in more detail? Then take the time to examine the Bible in depth and, quote, test the inspired expressions to see whether they originate with God. That's a direct quote from 1 John 4, verse 1. The article goes on. You can do this with the help of the magazine The Watchtower, which regularly discusses Bible prophecies and explains their application to our day. Thus, as you become convinced that the end of the present troubled world is close, you too will be able to lift your head up. You will also learn what you must do to enjoy the blessings of the Messianic kingdom, which will soon intervene in world affairs for the benefit of all right-hearted people.
Mm-hmm.
The first problem here is with who's it being addressed. It's obviously you
Mm-hmm.
that can expect your deliverance
So
near
it's, yeah,
at hand.
it's not a general prophetic statement in the future. This is what's going to happen. It's being directed to the person reading the magazine that they're going to see it.
Right. Now what's the problem with that, some will say? Well, the problem is context again, both geographical, historical, and prophetic.
And what year was that?
This is 1987.
So, if you were an adult reading this magazine in 1987, how old would you be today? And it still wouldn't have happened.
But first, before we get to the personal application to the reader, let's look at the context in Luke 21, starting from verse 20.
Furthermore, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by encamped armies, then know that the desolating of her has drawn near. Then let those in Judea begin fleeing to the mountains, and let those in the midst of her withdraw, and let those in the country places not enter into her, because these are the days for meting out justice, that all the things written may be fulfilled. Woe to the pregnant woman and the one suckling a baby in those days, for there will be great necessity upon the land, and wrath on this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive into all the nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled on by the nations, until the appointed time of the nations are fulfilled. Also there will be signs in sun and moon and stars, and on the earth anguish of nations, not knowing the way out because of the roaring of the sea and its agitation, while men become faint out of fear and expectation of the things coming upon the inhabited earth. For the powers of the heavens will be shaken, and then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. But as these things start to occur, raise yourselves erect and lift your heads up, because your deliverance is getting near.
How many problems do you see in a mere 8 verses with the application by the Watchtower?
Yeah, well, they don't look at the context, for one thing. They only picked the verse 28, right?
So the geographic problems right away.
Mm-hmm.
Who are the people that are being talked about in this entire passage? Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
Judea, in verse 21.
Yeah.
Days of vengeance, that all these woes will come upon this people.
Mm-hmm.
Stuff about pregnant women and nursing babies that you can relate to because of
Yeah.
what your mom was taught in the 1960s.
So that's another time when they just take verse 23 out and don't put it in context. So now it's just women in Toronto with a suckling, me, that have to worry about the end is going to come.
In 1962?
Yeah.
Or before, yeah.
Yeah, around 62, I guess.
Great wrath on this people, and they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive into all nations. I think we know what this is about.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the famous and the only reference to the Gentile times, of the appointed times of the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled.
Mm-hmm.
So putting the word nations in there, as the New World Translation renders it, is not helpful.
No.
Because you can say in the context it's about Jews and it's about Gentiles.
Yeah. So this is just another way in which they obscure the obvious by changing the wording. We're going to come to another one, I think, in the next video, where they do the same thing.
Yeah, and these signs, in case someone should say, and I can see some of us would have a problem with, well, you saying it all happened in the first century to the Jews? Well, maybe not. Maybe there's a part about the future coming of Christ, but verse 27, immediately before the verse they identify as applying to to not only them, but to you, the reader of Awake and Watchtower. What's the problem with verse 27?
It says, then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Not understand, they will see the Son of Man coming. So for a Christian, when they see this verse, they think about the second coming. But a Jehovah's Witness doesn't think about the second coming in that sense, because they're told it was an invisible coming. Nobody saw it.
That's why they need the composite sign starting in 1914, to make up for the fact that Christ is not visibly returning, so that men may see him coming with the clouds. It's an interesting contrast here, because Luke says they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. And who's the they? It's not the spiritual who will understand. It is men,
Yeah,
the nations, that will see him coming
yeah,
and will understand because they will see. Whereas in Matthew you have the sign of the Son of Man. Not a composite sign, the sign of the Son of Man, and the same coming with the clouds. But here it's just the Son of Man. So there is no composite sign. And that's a subject for another video. But the very fact that they completely wrench this verse out of context, and that's just the first problem, the context. When you get to the next part, would you like to know your future in more detail? Well, do we not realize, if we're ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, and if there's any witnesses watching this, you should know this, that this is the essence of occultism,
yeah.
knowing your future.
Yeah. So they're not doing prophecy anymore. Now they're doing horoscopes. What you're going to see.
What's the fascination that they rightly talk about in the prior paragraph? What's the fascination with the occult today, except that the occult will tell you something about your life and your family's life, and even life after death, that you can't get from the Bible.
Yeah.
So the very fact that the Watchtower is making this so personal to the reader is occultic in itself. So they go on along that tack by saying you can test the authority of the Watchtower. You can test its horoscopic or oracular authority by reading this magazine, and by, it says, quoting 1 John 4:1, test the inspired expressions to see whether they originate with God. But there is a barb attached to that too. This is the year we were testing the inspired expression.
Yeah. It's so test it if you're not baptized. But if you're baptized and you do this, and you're not just using current magazines, like the person who would be reading this and being told to do this, he'd only have current magazines. But if you go back and look at their history and check their authority, you're going to be out, because they're not going to tolerate you saying, well, I tested it and it didn't prove you have God's authority.
The poor person reading this, not knowing anything about the Watchtower or its history, will only have their word to go on when it comes to testing their authority.
Yeah, and even what they've said in the past.
But nevertheless, it still says boldly, you can do this with the help of the magazine, The Watchtower, which regularly discusses Bible prophecies. That's true. And explains their applications to our day. That's true. Application to our day, though, is a pregnant phrase, is it not? Because that's the difference with Bible prophecy. It's usually not about our day.
Yeah.
It might be, but it's usually not.
It's a future hope, or, I mean, it could be in your day, but you're not pinning everything on it being in your day.
Nevertheless, they say, their bottom line at the end of the page is, thus as you become convinced that the end of the present troubled world is close, you too will be able to lift your head up. And all this is being thrown back upon Jesus, that he's telling you, as well as, of course, people who are Jehovah's Witnesses, that this is the generation.
So anyone who actually believes that, and then it doesn't happen, Jesus gets the blame, and they could be accountable for a lot of people just turning faith away from Scripture, not realizing that they manipulate, that they take things out of context. They just sort of scrap the whole thing.
They do. We might ask at this point, were they more precise than this? They're definitely telling the 1987 generation that you are the people. But did they get more precise? And I think in the next segment we'll see some evidence that they didn't back off this generation. They actually threw a number into it again, and it's by coincidence, the number 75. This time not about the date, but
1975.
rather about the number of days constituting a generation. So in the next segment we'll look at that, but also they use some other comparisons, signs of the times, such as peace and security, to prove that indeed that event, that is the imposition of God's judgment on this world, would happen in the very near future, and put really a time limit upon it, as we'll see in subsequent videos.
Okay.